Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider with you once again. A little bit of a schedule change, a little bit different this week. We had to work around some of our own personal schedules. We were selfish guys this week, but we decided to go on a Thursday night instead of a Wednesday night. We apologize if that threw any of you off. While we kind of changed the program up a little bit, but we're still going to have the same great stuff, same analysis. Unfortunately, Connor Howe could not join us this week, our one of our usual co-hosts. But I do have my partner in crime, Scott Schulze. Scott, how are you doing?
Amazing. Well, other than the technical issues, I'm alive, so that's a good thing. We had a interesting night. It's actually good we did not do this last night, because last night we had a tornado come through around 9 o'clock a couple miles from our house.
I heard about that.
So it was kind of nice to, we were kind of following on the news, and it came fairly close. I think it ended up a couple maybe 2 or 3 miles from us, so we managed to avoid that. But had we been doing the podcast, about halfway through I would have been jumping off into some
well, then it ended up working out for everybody, and everybody's okay, that your friends, family, you guys, everybody's okay with what happened?
Yeah, pretty much almost every tornado over here always seems to end up in the country. So I think the news, there was like a Family Dollar and a gas station that looked like they were damaged, and so that was like the same thing they kept showing over and over and over on the news. But yeah, I mean, obviously there was no one immediate, and it looked like it was mostly in the rural parts of where we're at. So yeah, and other than, some power going out and trees going down, as far as I know, there were no fatalities or anything like that.
Well, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Every geographical area's got their something, we in Southern California, we don't get the tornadoes, but we obviously get the earthquakes. Knock on wood, we haven't had one for a while, but those are pretty scary out here. And obviously, for those who are tuning in and live in the Southern California area, you might have heard about some weird flooding stuff that is occurring in Newport Beach. So we get some stuff out here too, even though California is known for having its good weather and no tornadoes and all of that stuff. So I hear you. That stuff can be scary, but I'm glad everybody's okay. A lot to get to tonight, Scott. Some of it is kind of more NFL related. Some of it is, obviously a little bit more focused in on the Bengals. I will say that we had one topic of discussion we were going to do, but we're going to put that off, I believe, till next week, where we kind of look over the schedule once again now that the Bengals have added some draft pieces, and see how that affects maybe our win-loss predictions. But we'll do that next week. And so what we're going to do this week is we will be taking fan questions once again. There's some live viewers in our YouTube chat. People, you can join us on Cincy Jungle as well. Every episode, we're live there. So join in on the fun. Send us your question in the chat room. Send it on Twitter at Bengals OBI. In the comment thread at Cincy Jungle, we'll scour those and try and get to some of those at the end. We like obviously hearing from you all and answering your questions. So Scott, let's dive in. The NFL has made a number of rule changes. So this time of year is camp practices are happening, and excitement's getting high around the fan bases around the league, because they're getting their first glimpses of the year of teams. But around this time of year also comes some potential rule changes, things of that nature, and there's been a few. One is affecting overtime, one is affecting roster cuts, one is affecting injured reserve with the designation to return. And then there's also one about the celebrations and easing up on that, which will make for an interesting discussion, I think. But let's start with the overtime. The owners approved shortening overtime, and if you want the information on this, there's a great piece on cincyjungle.com, so check that out. Jason Markham did a nice recap of all of the rules. Basically, owners approved shortening overtime in the preseason and regular season from 15 minutes to 10 minutes. It's to shorten games, and then obviously this is kind of especially interesting if you're a Bengals fan, because the Bengals went and had a tie against the Redskins in that game in London last year. So basically, there's kind of still the same format. They're just cutting it down, I think, in terms of time. What do you think the impact is on that for the league and the Bengals? Because Marvin Lewis has been the master of tie games since he's been the head coach of the Bengals.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I like one thing was odd is they came out and said, or kind of implied, the whole reason was player safety, that you would have fewer injuries because you have fewer plays, which seems kind of interesting because there's very few overtime games, and of those, there's very few that go the whole 15 minutes. So you're cutting out maybe a drive out of a dozen or more drives in a game. So on average, each player is maybe playing 5 or 10 less snaps, and somehow that's going to, fewer is probably safer, but it just seems if that's their goal, there's probably other ways to do it. I did look at some of the statistics because kind of curious, okay, we're changing the overtime rule. You're shedding the final 5 minutes. What does that do as far as, game, how it affects games as far as win losses and more ties? And since 2002, there have been 83 playoff games, and only 22 of them have gone past that 10 minutes. So that's like 4 games per season. And if you figure there's something like 256 games, that's basically 1.5 or 1.6% of games each year that are affected. So very, very, very few games that are actually affected. And so it just seems like it's, a very minuscule thing. It just seems kind of odd also, since the league likes to make money, and you make money by being on the TV longer, not less.
Yeah.
So you think, you get more advertising if you're on the game or if you're on your show. So I'm not quite sure what the reason was. I mean, I know they said player safety, but if you're, 1.5% of games are being reduced, by a couple minutes, I'm not really sure what that does. I think the one thing it might do is maybe change the impact of how teams play. So maybe force you to play a little more aggressively. But there's other ways you could do that too. You could just say, hey, we're going to start, by moving kickoffs forward or back, or get rid of, extra point attempts on, kicking extra point attempts. There's different things you could do to try to force teams to be more creative. Now, as a fantasy football person, I love this. And the reason for that is, in fantasy football, anything you can do to reduce the variability in the scoring is great. So, if you're playing an opponent and the guy ends up with his quarterback or running back in overtime, he basically gets an extra quarter to rack up more points against you. So this cuts it down a little bit. So it kind of makes more of an even playing field. So from a fantasy perspective, I like it. Overall, I just don't see it making that much of an impact because it's such a rare occurrence to begin with. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of neutral on the whole thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about it, and I like that you brought up player safety because obviously not only thinking about playing an extra quarter in a game and a star player potentially getting injured in that extra quarter is a concern, but also you got to think about long-term fatigue where say an overtime game is played on a Sunday, right? A team plays on Sunday and they have to turn around and play again on Thursday night, and they played 5 quarters, whereas the team they're playing on Thursday night maybe just had a standard 4-quarter game. There might be an obvious disadvantage there in terms of fatigue, injuries, all of that. So that plays into it. And I also like that you brought up strategy. And I think part of the reason I see 2 reasons why some of these rule changes occurred. Number one, I think Goodell really listened to, according to what I've heard about the celebration stuff and other rule changes, it sounds like he really listened to owners and players when it came time to propose these rule changes and get them passed, which is a good thing. I mean, you need to kind of have your employees, if you will, have their voices be heard. So, I think that played into it. But I also think that, it's not really good for the league to see a tie, even though it advertising perspective and all of that aside, it kind of muddies the waters. You look at it, and this also kind of plays into the strategy aspect, like you mentioned, that now this is going with the extended field goals that are further back. More teams might be going for 2 because of that, and then so there's a lot of. It's almost becoming a more strategic league based on some of these things. Like you said, more aggressive play calling potentially in overtime. Maybe overtime gets avoided because of missed extra points, all of that. And in the case of the Bengals, they went to overtime with the Redskins last year, I believe, because Mike Nugent had some kicking issues in that game. So pretty interesting stuff. I think it just kind of enhances the strategy of teams. For those that don't believe Marvin Lewis is the greatest in-game manager, this might be a little bit of a hindrance, but maybe we'll see. Maybe we won't see Lewis get so many ties now with the Bengals now that this rule change is proposed and passed. So again, it's 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes in the overtime period. Still the same rules apply where it's not sudden death like it was before. If you kick a field goal, the other team has a chance to score and tie or win, that sort of thing. Moving on, Scott. Roster cuts. This is an interesting rule change. Basically, it seems as if teams. Well, the thing was teams had to get to 75 players before the final preseason game. Now there's basically, and there was kind of sporadic cuts, and part of, if you're a Hard Knocks fan, part of what made that interesting is you kind of saw a player, you got connected to players, and then maybe they made the first cut, but they didn't make the second, and then they didn't make the final cut, that sort of thing. But basically, there's one cut down now. And it basically is that 90-man roster to 53. Now, this to me is really interesting, and I have a specific reason why. What do you make of this, that basically there's one massive cut down day for teams now instead of the multiple cuts throughout the preseason?
It is kind of interesting. I think for as far as perspective goes of, let's say, your fringe players, maybe your undrafted free agents, or some of these guys who might have been in your practice squad for a year or two that you want to get an extra look. I guess it gives you an extended chance to look at them, because generally when you're cutting from 90 to 75, I mean, most teams pretty much know who they're getting rid of. That's usually the easier cut. The harder cut is when you go from the 75 to the 53 and you're deciding, who is that last offensive lineman? Who is, are we taking one extra defensive back because he's good on special teams? Are we, maybe going with that, fourth tight end versus, I think the more interesting cuts are probably that second round. And I think one thing too that, well, I guess we'll see how it plays out this first year, but there's no rule saying that you must, make those remaining, 37 cuts on that day. So in theory, if the Bengals know that, hey, there's 10, 20 guys that halfway through camp that we know just aren't going to be on our roster, there's nothing saying you can't cut them early. I mean, you don't have to wait until that last day to make every cut. So I'm kind of curious to see if teams do that, if they just wait until the very end and say, okay, we're just shedding half our roster at this point, or if they go through a little longer. And I guess the one thing it does, I guess it does a couple good things. One, those fringe players who might be battling for a practice squad spot somewhere, it gives them a little more chance to get a little more tape to try to make it on another team when they ultimately do get cut, instead of getting cut early and then just kind of floating around hoping someone grabs them. I think the other thing it does, and I'm assuming this is probably why they did this, is it gives your starters, I guess, more of a break in preseason. Yeah. I mean, we've seen it now with the OTAs where the Bengals said, we're not going to have every kicker kick every day because, obviously a kicker kicking 5 times a day is just going to win the guy. We don't want our 5th round pick, Jake Elliott, to get, to overexert himself by kicking the ball every single day. So we're going to rotate him. So I think it's a similar kind of thing where they're hey, this guy's probably not going to make our roster, but there's no reason to, have AJ Green out there every single play. We know what he's going to do. Let's, kind of preserve him. And same with the other players. So I'm assuming that's the biggest reason. Is it gives the guys who probably aren't going to make the team more of a chance to be on the team, more of a chance to get more tape, and more of a chance to keep the starters rested until the games really start counting.
Yeah, and in the preseason, because of cut down day and all that stuff, and when they, as teams get more practices and reps under their belt, that third preseason game is kind of known as the dress rehearsal, if you will, and your starters usually play 2 or 3 quarters. That may not be the case now, especially with still hanging on to so many players. You may not need to now, and that could be a deterrent by the time the regular season rolls around, but it also is a major plus because then you're not necessarily trotting out Pro Bowl players and having them get hurt in week 2, week 3 of the preseason in a meaningless game where they could maybe play a quarter instead of 2 or 3, get the needed reps and get out of there. And it does showcase the younger players as well. I find it interesting, aside from everything you mentioned, because I agree with you there. I find it interesting in the respect of kind of more tape on players, but less availability in terms of time frame. So what I mean by that is the Bengals have been one team, but others do it as well, where on final cutdown day or second to final cutdown day, they look at a player and they may add them, even though they seem to have their roster quote unquote set. They still may get rid of a guy or two and add a guy or two that was cut by another team. That's what the Bengals did with Brandon Tate. They've done it with other players before, and they add them to the final roster after final cuts. It's just going to be interesting to see how that gets affected based on players being either being on these fringe guys being on the field longer, maybe them not being available earlier in the preseason, that sort of thing. That kind of interests me in terms of this move. But all in all, I think it's good for teams. It's good for young players trying to find jobs. And this has been a major point of contention for NFL players, veterans, starters in terms of the preseason. They don't like the preseason. They want to see it cut down, and maybe this is a step towards that because they may not have to take as many snaps in those games because guys are being held on to a little longer. But again, there's kind of now one cut down day from 90 to 53. That's going to be interesting. Now, this one is a biggie, I think. It's the injured reserve designation to return, Scott. Basically, this was a new rule adopted, I think, a couple of years ago, where instead of being on the PUP list for 6 weeks, and instead of missing the entire season, if a guy was maybe slated to miss 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and you really wanted him back and he proved to be healthy, they could be placed on this IR designation to return. Last year, the Bengals had a couple of players who were eligible for that, and Cedric Pierman and William Jackson. Teams were only allowed to bring back one player from the designated to return IR list, and the Bengals brought back Pierman, which may have rubbed fans the wrong way. They kind of wanted to see William Jackson out on the field, and especially when the season kind of got out of hand at the end there. But now it says basically, I believe it's 2 players now that are able to be returning from IR designated to return. This to me is interesting. The Bengals have had some injury issues, and unfortunately, they either have misdiagnosed guys or guys have they just said, hey, we're going to shelve them for the year, and you kind of hear later on, well, maybe they were ready to play at the end of the year. So the impact of this rule change, Scott, is what, not only on the Bengals but around the league?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've always thought the IR thing was kind of silly, and this is kind of coming from someone who kind of grew up following baseball a lot closer. And in baseball, they have the disabled list for so many period of days. So it's like 5 days, 15 days, 30, whatever. But there's no such thing as far as more in baseball of a 162 DL or disabled list period where you say during spring training, this guy's just out for the season with absolutely no chance of coming back. So if he gets healthy in August, he's screwed. And it's very odd in football they do it that way, that they say, we're just going to say before the season even starts, the guy's hurt pretty bad. He may or may not come back, but because the rules, the way they're set up, we just have to say he's out for the year, which I think is very unfair because, as you mentioned, this past year, the Bengals had a couple guys who did come back who ultimately were healthy. And there's, probably guys in the previous years who the same thing, probably come November, December, they probably could have played, but because they were on IR, they weren't able to come back. And so like you said, we saw that with the Bengals, and they had to choose between Cedric Pierman, the journeyman special teamer the veteran special teamer, and the first-round pick, William Jackson. And yeah, I agree. A lot of fans would have wanted to see Jackson because he was a first-round pick, and the season's over. So why not see what you can get with this guy? So any move they make to increase the number of guys that can come back from IR, I think is a great thing, because I think it's more fair to the teams and more fair to the players to give them that chance to come back, because sometimes it's hard to know in August, how healthy a guy is going to be, 3 months down the road. You don't really know, is the surgery going to take? Was it as bad as we thought it was going to be? Did he have a really good rehab? You just don't really know those questions. And it just seems so unfair to these players and to teams and everyone involved to say, yeah, you're just done. Regardless of what happens, you're just done for the year. So anything they do to improve that, I can only say is a positive.
Yeah. And, obviously the argument would be that, say a team is kind of in that playoff push towards the end of the year, and they have a Pro Bowl player or two on IR designated to return, and those are players that could come back and potentially push them over the edge to get them into the postseason because of their performances. And I think it just makes teams more competitive, and it's a league that's built on parity, as we've heard so many times. And I think it's overall, I agree. I think it's a good thing. I think that, some players, while some players get rushed back too soon from rehab or an injury, there are many players who obviously are disappointed that their season has ended really sometimes before it began. And maybe it didn't really need to be that way. Maybe they could have, come back at a later date and still played well and remained healthy the rest of the way. So, and I think this, modern medicine is what it is now. Players can bounce back and recover from what used to be very significant injuries, and they can come back a little faster than they used to. So I think that also plays into that. The last rule change, Scott, and this one is interesting. Roger Goodell sent a letter to the league basically saying that players will, quote, have more room to have fun after they make big plays. There's been a lot of penalties and fines and all of that based on taunting, based on excessive celebration in the end zone, all of that stuff. We Cincy Jungle did a post on it, kind of asking the writers some of their favorite celebrations they've seen from Bengal players over the handful of years. And I noted one that it was Chad Johnson putting the football with the pylon. That, while it was entertaining and while his stunts kind of got old to me after a while, that cost him $5,000 for that simple thing. So I guess what my question to you is your mindset on this? Are you more of an old school guy that says, hey, act like you've been there before, have some fun, but let's keep it under control? Or do you like seeing these guys because it is such a highly emotional sport that is very physical and momentum can swing at any moment based on a play? Are you are you more of that guy who says, hey, who cares? Let them have fun. It's sports, but it's also entertainment. So I don't know, your thoughts.
I'd say I'm definitely, I'm more of the Barry Sanders fan in that regard. Cross the end zone, toss the ball to the ref, jogging over the sideline. That being said, I recognize not everyone has that same mindset that I do. And, it is a very physical, emotional charge game. I mean, you're obviously pushing, fighting. And, hey, you make the big play. We finally accomplished the goal, get across the goal line. And, at the end of the day, it's a game. And so I'm okay with the celebrations as long as I think my only caveat to that is as long as they're not doing anything explicit. And, as far as like vulgar where you wouldn't want to be watching it with like your kids or grandparents or whatever. And, have to, be like, okay, that's just over the line. Or I guess I'm also not a big fan of the props because that kind of shows like a premeditated nature. And it's not so much an outburst of excitement, but it's more about me. It's more, I'm going to enhance my brand and I'm, pre-planning these, setting, getting kind of things, like the cell phone or the Sharpie, there. So when I cross the goal, I can sign the football and, take a phone call and that kind of silly. So those are where I kind of draw the line is I'm not a huge fan of, anything that's, a bit explicit or where they have like the props pre staged in the end zone. But anything other than that, where you're just celebrating like, yeah, that was a heck of a play. We just, we finally drove down the field, finally scored on these guys. If you want to, slam dunk the ball over the goalpost or, do the icky shuffle or the electric slide or, whatever, those kind of things I'm cool with. One thing I will say I find very interesting is a lot of the cameras, as soon as someone scores the touchdown, they focus right on the guy that does that celebration. They pretty much zoom right on them, and as they go to the sidelines, and every time Chad Johnson scored, all the cameras were on him because they wanted to show what he was going to do. And then what did the same media people do later that day? On the sports talk shows and on the radio the next day, they grumble about the players doing these things.
Yeah.
And it's kind of silly that we're going to show this and we're going to keep showing this to you and we're going to show it as a highlight. And then the next day we're going to grumble about how horrible it is that these people are doing. Well, if you don't think it's that good, they just, if those folks don't want to see them do it, just don't show it. So, but if they're going to show it, then I'm perfectly, fine, because now the league's saying they can do it. And as long as it's not over the line and it's not, some 5-minute, we're all going to line up and do, some big river dance thing together as a big group and do like a whole entire song, okay. Yeah, there's definitely some boundaries but I guess I'm not too opposed to it. I usually don't get too much into them. So if there's more of them, I can't say I'm going to be watching more of them. That's usually when I get up and, get a drink, go to the bathroom anyways, right after they score. So I don't see too many of the dances anyway. So I can't say it. Yeah, I can't say it bothers me much one way or the other. Yeah. But I did love the Icky Shuffle.
Well, yeah. I mean, every Bengals fan loves the Icky Shuffle. So I like the fact that they're loosening it up. And, the last thing you want to see is, your team's down by 5 with a minute and a half to play, and all of a sudden, you score an 80-yard touchdown, and your team is psyched, and the player who scored the touchdown, maybe he throws the ball into the stands, and all of a sudden, a subsequent 15-yard penalty happens, and then the team that you just came back on gets excellent field position on the ensuing kickoff. They come down and they tie or win the game from that. I mean, that's to me, if you're a fan of that team, that stinks. I am old school like you. I don't like to see utterly ridiculous things. And when I saw this rule, I kind of thought, I don't know if you've seen this movie, Scott, Basketball. It came out in the late 90s, and it stars the creators of South Park. It's a bit crude, but there is a part in it where it kind of talked about how sports devolved, I guess, into only wanting money, and they showed these elaborate – it was more about celebrations and showmanship and instead of the sport. and there were some really funny celebrations. So those who have seen the movie Basketball know what I'm talking about. But I also, my main concern with it is the gray area for this is huge. So while you look at it and you say, okay, the celebration Antonio Brown did, I think it was last year or the year before, where he was basically air humping after he scored a touchdown, that's not going to be allowed. The one from a few years back where Randy Moss pretended to moon the Green Bay team and put his butt on the field goal post, that's not going to be allowed. But what's the gray area? Or where do you draw the line? Is if a guy absolutely spikes the ball too hard, is that excessive? If he kicks the ball into the stands, is that excessive? If he gets other players involved, which was previously outlawed, is that now allowed? I worry about the gray area, and I worry about, hey, Goodell said he listened to the players on this one, and is it just going to get out of control and then they rein it back in a year or two from now? Are they still going to maintain control in terms of the referees in the game when it comes to this kind of stuff? Is it going to be after not every play, but I mean, there are big plays quite frequently in a game. Is every first down going to be ridiculously celebrated? Every big tackle? I just kind of worry about that. Do you?
Yeah, I think the one thing you mentioned that kind of resonates is the making the refs basically police it. Because, if you're a referee, I don't really think that should be part of your job. You shouldn't have to, you're not dancing with the stars ref. You shouldn't have to sit there and, get your little score sheet and say, okay, that was a little over, or okay, technically, okay, that's 15 yards, or, oh, okay, you're just on our line. There's more important things the ref should be doing. So I'd say unless it's just something egregious, like where you're like, okay, that's just not called. They probably shouldn't flag them at all and just leave it up to the league to say, either do it to do with replay, have a guy in the booth who's like part of the corporate office in New York or something that calls the refs up on the field and says, hey, flag that, or just wait till the game's over and send that guy a bill in the mail next day saying, hey, you're fined $10,000 because that was over the line. And instead of making the refs try to make that decision, because let's say you have 16 games one week, you have 16 officiating crews, 16 different referees, and yeah, you want to be consistent, but the nature of it, there's going to be certain variability, and each ref is going to have in their own mind what they think, regardless of how much training you try to show that this is okay, this isn't. It's a judgment call, and it's right there at the spot. And it depends on where he's standing, what he hears, what he sees, where the players are. It may look one way to the TV, may look another way to the fans, and may look another way to the ref standing right there next to him. So, to me, I guess policing that isn't something I think the refs should have to do. So I guess I would prefer that either the league comes out with some sort of way to make it to make that easier on the refs, because the last thing you want is to be, fighting for a playoff spot and then you get a very arbitrary flag call on a celebration that you could argue that 3 times earlier in the game there was a similar celebration that wasn't flagged, and then all of a sudden, and the fans and players are like, well, what the heck? That's not something that, at least to me, I don't think the refs should have to be policing that.
I absolutely agree. And you may have referees on the older end of the age spectrum who may be way more conservative in this respect and are a little bit more flag happy when it comes to the celebrations. And you may have maybe a newer ref, younger end of the age spectrum, who may allow more. It's kind of arbitrary, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. In terms of referees, I am interested to see when Ed Hockley calls a excessive celebration penalty, because he likes to really put out a soliloquy when he explains penalties. So I'm interested to see how he explains some of that stuff. We had an interesting comment in the YouTube chat from Jungle Growler. He says, I hate this rule change. Remember the Steelers dancing in the end zone after that cheap shot on Giovanni Bernard, which is in reference to that 2015 wild card game. Ryan Shazier hit what, in my opinion, should have been a penalty, a helmet-to-helmet hit on Bernard as he was catching a pass, and he was out for the rest of the game. And two Steelers defensive backs, as he was being tended to by trainers, two Steelers defensive backs were dancing and celebrating as he was laying on the ground, and that should have been flagged as well. Wasn't. So again, it's an arbitrary rule. I'm not huge on it. I'm glad the players are happy about it, I guess, but I don't know. I think Jeremy Hill's probably going to be pretty creative if he gets into the end zone this year, and he's been in the end zone quite frequently in his career, so he'll probably get pretty creative. But it also delays the game a bit. You know, if after many first downs, guys are celebrating after each catch, that sort of thing, can slow the game down a bit, and that's something to consider as well. What do you think about the rule changes? You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Bengals OBI. We're on Cincy Jungle. All of our content's there. We're also live there every week, as we are on our YouTube channel. Join us there. If you're unable to join us live, you can catch the content on iTunes, at Cincy Jungle, as I mentioned, on YouTube, and the audio links are on SoundCloud. Please download. Let us know what you think. Give us comments, and we'd love to hear back from you. We will be trying and taking some fan questions a little bit later in the show, so leave those either in the comment thread at Cincy Jungle or in the YouTube chat. We'll try and get to those in a little bit. Scott, let's change gears. The Bengals are now engaging in some OTA practices. We're getting some first glimpses at some guys. From what I've seen, read, written about, things are looking pretty positive. Dre Kirkpatrick, just an update. He did have a hand injury, I believe, on the first day of practice. Doesn't seem serious, I don't believe, so he should be fine. But so far, everybody looks pretty good. I'm going to ask you about a couple of guys who have apparently stood out in terms of how they've looked so far. And the first one I want to talk to you about is Cody Core. Apparently, he's bulked up a bit, looks good in practices, and this is a big offseason for him because the Bengals brought in John Ross and Josh Malone in the draft while also bringing back Brandon LaFell in free agency. So it seems as if the Bengals want to keep 7 wide receivers. Even if they keep 6, he may have the inside track over a guy like Alex Erickson because of return skills of some of the rookies they brought in. But what are your thoughts on Cody Core? And is this a good sign for things to come based on a rookie year that, you know, didn't light the world on fire, but there were a couple games where he's making some nice catches. He had the deep ball catch against the Eagles, which was nice to see. What do you make of Cody Core and how he supposedly is looking in OTAs?
I mean, it's kind of mixed. I mean, obviously, it's a good thing to see guys doing well in OTAs, but then again, it's also OTAs. I mean, it's not regular season. It's not even preseason. It's not even training camp. So you've got obviously several layers to go before you get to, you know, the real, you know, on the field, let's see. But that being said, it's nice to see a guy doing well in practice, and you kind of look at who they have on their roster. And as you mentioned, they just added Ross. They re-signed LaFell. Tyler Boyd was just drafted last year. You have A.J. Green. So there's 4 spots that aren't going anywhere. They just drafted Josh Malone, so you figure he's probably going to make the roster. So there's 5 folks right there. If you add Core, okay, you've got 6, and now you have, you know, a 7th guy being, you know, one of your undrafted guys from this year or last year, or Alex Erickson, the returner. And as you mentioned, he's someone who I actually think Alex Erickson's someone who could probably be on the outside looking in, just because they did get some other return guys with the kid from Houston in the draft, and then also John Ross can return kicks.
Yep.
And he had that great preseason punt return. He had some decent returns, but for much of the year, it seemed like Erickson didn't quite capture the level of excitement that we saw in preseason. So who knows if year 2 will be better. The other thing with Erickson, too, is they never really used him in the offense. He was just limited to special teams. And I think that's one thing that going forward, if they are going to keep a guy, you know, for a 6th or 7th receiver, they're probably going to look for a guy who can contribute something on the offense, who they trust enough to actually run some offensive plays with. So I think Core's position is safe. The only downside is, I mean, if he wants to impress the team, this is basically when he has to do it. He has to do it now in OTAs and in camp, because as deep as he probably is going to be on that depth chart, he's probably not going to get much of a chance, especially when you get to preseason game 2 and 3, and then once the real thing starts, because it's probably safe to say Ross, Boyd, LaFell, and Green are the top 4. And for a 5th receiver to get on the field, he's probably not going to see a lot of playing time. So anything these guys can do now who are that deep in the depth chart to get a chance, I think he's probably safe for the roster, but to get playing time, I think he's really got to shine. And so it's nice to see him do that. He is one of the bigger receivers they have at 6'3". And I guess I know he was 210. I don't know if that's what he is up to, or is bigger than that, or just maybe reshaped that 210. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's a good thing, and it's something you'd like to see, because for those guys who are lower on the totem pole, this is pretty much their only chance to really show that that they should get more snaps than they do.
Yeah, and the apparently with Core, it's not, you hear from the coaches, you hear in this time of year, everybody looks good, right? I mean, in the practices, everybody looks good. It's shorts, it's drills, but via Bengals.com, quarterback Andy Dalton said, quote unquote, he's fast. You can tell he's put in a lot of work. He looks really good. Adam Jones says, I like Cody Core. He competes every day. He's a good kid. I love guys that can compete, that live to go out and have fun. He can run, and he's going to do all the work in there blocking. He's a competing player. Cody has a chance to be something special. In terms of what he's done in terms of the offseason and workouts and everything else, Core said, after my first year, I had time to figure out what I wanted to do, how I wanted to train and eat, just training and being smart, just wanting to be great. Core wasn't, when the Bengals picked him in the 6th round last year, he wasn't on a lot of teams' radars or a lot of draftniks' radars in terms of a guy who may even be drafted, but he was a guy at 6'3", 210, 215, and he ran just a little over a 4.4 40-yard dash in pre-draft workouts. So he has that long speed. You saw that on that deep ball against the Eagles that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, as the offense became stale with so many star players out of the lineup, Eifert, A.J. Green, that sort of thing, towards the stretch, he was more of a, quick catch, try and get yards after the catch type of guy towards the end of the year. So, maybe he's a guy that can look at as the occasional deep threat, but they drafted a very similar guy in Josh Malone in the 4th round this year. So that's going to be interesting, an interesting battle to look at. You mentioned Erickson. Last year, played in all 16 games, just had 6 catches on 8 targets, 71 yards, and three first downs on those 6 catches. So nothing to write home about there. Nothing too great on the punt return aspect, but did lead the NFL in yards per kick return and I believe overall yards in kick returns. And though that aspect of the game has been diminished with certain rule changes of late, that is something something that he has on his resume that could help him be an incumbent guy this year. I think they try and keep 7 receivers if they can. The problem is that position group's really crowded. Cornerback is really crowded. Defensive tackle is very crowded. So in order to do that, you got to go short, probably a quarterback. They can't keep 3 this year like they did last year. And they got to get creative with offensive linemen, and that's why they've drafted guys in the past handful of years and or brought in undrafted free agents who have made the team, or veterans, for that matter, who can play different positions. Eric Winston is a guard tackle. Andre Smith is slated to be a guard this year, but has tackle experience. You have J.J. Dielman, who could play all parts of the interior line. And even Cedric Abwehi, played guard and tackle at Texas A&M. So maybe they go short there and just have a bunch of versatile guys once again to help them be able to go deep at some of those position groups I mentioned. Scott, one of my favorite picks in this year's draft, and he has been receiving praise so far, not only for just kind of his work on the field, but just the kind of guy he is third-round pick Jordan Willis, the defensive end out of Kansas State. Very, in terms of an interview, very smart guy, very humble, very quiet. He's got a great motor, great productivity. The team really likes him. I think a lot of people were surprised he was available at the top of the third round, as they were with Carl Lawson maybe being available at the top of the fourth. I know Willis is probably going to be taking a back seat in terms of snaps and looks early on behind Michael Johnson, Carlos Dunlap, that sort of thing. But I still think this kid can have a good impact, especially from what we're hearing in OTAs. Do you have any – I know we've talked about all the draft picks on this show, but now that we've kind of seen him and others in action, what do you make of Willis and what he's shown so far in OTAs?
I'd say I think it's a good thing, and especially because one of the biggest complaints I think a lot of fans have had, and I have to assume the team has noticed it too, is the pass rush from the right defensive end position. And it seems like, as long as I can remember as a Bengals fan, I really can't remember a great right defensive end, at least over the last 15, 20 years since Lewis has been there, where we've had a great edge rush. When Michael Johnson's been there for such a long time, we had, I think Antoine Odom was there. He might have had one mediocre season. It just seems like it's a position that has really struggled. I know PFF really seemed to like Willis coming out of Kansas State and kind of considered him a great steal. So if he can get in there, and I know in the Bengals' love for veterans, especially on the defensive side of the ball, I'm not sure Willis would be able to supplant Michael Johnson this year as a starter. So what probably happens is Johnson plays the running downs and Willis plays the passing downs, and I'm perfectly cool with that. So anything that Willis can do in OTAs and camp to justify that, I am all for. So it sounds like if he's impressing them enough to get that chance in training camp, then I think that'd be a great thing.
Yeah, and the last time the Bengals one of the last times they drafted a defensive end in the third round was Michael Johnson, and a guy, even though he hasn't always popped up big time on the stat sheet, he's been a very effective player for the Bengals and a nice supplemental piece for a long time, since 2009. He did have that 1 year stint in Tampa Bay, but came back, and I think he's been a very good player on and off the field. He's done a lot of good things for the community as well. For Cincinnati. In terms of Willis, and you mentioned that Willis may be more of a pass rush specialist, especially early on, but the guy did have I believe it was 20 sacks his final 2 years at Kansas State, and I think he had about 30 and a half tackles for loss overall. So he can play the run, and Paul Gunther, the defensive coordinator of the Bengals, agrees via Bengals.com. When you watch him on tape, you can visualize him becoming a good pro, and so far he's shown every bit of it. He's everything you want. He never came off the field in college. He defends the run well. He rushes the passer. He always runs to the ball. We like our young guys. So you like hearing that. And Scott, I don't know. I know you're not a big Twitter guy, but I don't know if you saw this. Kind of going back to what players are saying about some of the younger guys. George Aloka was asked by a fan a little while back on Twitter, I think it was a couple weeks ago, saying, how do the rookies look? And George Aloka wrote, "You didn't hear this from me, but from what I've seen in shorts and jerseys, we picked up some ballers. Our draft this year was very underrated." So, again, that could be just a little bit of player speak. It could be, propping up the young guys and doing the right thing as a teammate. But, these guys also recognize a good player like Aloka recognizes other good players. And I think they are excited, even though free agency kind of was blah for the Bengals, and that's probably putting it kindly. I think the players got reinvigorated with the influx of young talent in the draft class. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard not to look at this draft and say they obviously got they got much faster and much more athletic. And I think that's one of the key things. They obviously got the fastest guy ever at the combine in the first round. Carl Larson, when he's healthy, is an absolute freak. And some of the air players, yeah, they're guys who are going to impress athletically and speed-wise, and you just hope that it translates on Sundays, which it looks like it will. It looks like they didn't just grab, your combine stars, but actual good players with a lot of really good tape. So, yeah, it's a very it seems like an astute comment from Aloka based on everything leading up to the draft and kind of the post-draft analysis as far as what these guys were able to do in college that you hope translates to the next level. And obviously OTAs is that very first step, and it's encouraging to see them doing well in OTAs because obviously, I mean, there's a long way to go, but it's nice to see that, hey, that first step to the NFL, you guys are looking as good as we were hoping you were looking. So that's obviously a very good thing and the thing we want to see more of. And I'm hoping that when we get to, training camp, that we're able to say the same thing and still able to say, wow, these guys look great.
Yep. And I think not only them staying healthy, but the Bengals getting dividends from their past couple of draft classes that they haven't really received, including this year's class, is going to be a key for them getting back to the postseason. Those guys are going to have to probably grow up pretty quick. And on various spots on all three units of the team, they're going to need to grow up quick, and they're going to need to prove that they've got good heads on their shoulders. And many of the picks that they chose do seem to have that, including Jordan Willis. And if you have not read that post on Bengals.com, do so. I have kind of a follow-up post coming up on Cincy Jungle about it as well, so check it out there. I mentioned it earlier. You can check out all of our content on our YouTube channel, on our SoundCloud channel. We're on iTunes as well, so download us. All of our content will be available. If you're not able to join us live on YouTube or Cincy Jungle, all of our content is also available on Cincy Jungle, as well as YouTube, as well as SoundCloud. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Bengals OBI. We're also available via email for any thoughts, comments, questions you want read on the air at theobinsider@gmail.com. Scott, I mentioned it earlier. We did get a couple of fan questions. Let's get through these a little quick, and then I guess we can get out of here. The first one I see in the YouTube chat is from Greg L., and Greg has been listening to the show for quite some time. So, Greg, good to have you back. He asks, who do you see starting next to Atkins? Is it Billings? Is it the fourth-round pick Glasgow, Brandon Thompson, Sims, Williams? There's also Marcus Hardison, who he didn't ask about, but that's another guy in there. Interestingly enough, Scott, with this question, you look at Atkins, Billings, Glasgow, and Thompson and Sims, and then even Hardison. All of those guys are either third or fourth round picks. And so the Bengals know what they're doing in terms of getting a defensive tackle that can produce at high levels, be it from the high end of the spectrum of Atkins to Sims and all these other guys. They know what they're doing when they get these middle round defensive tackles. They grabbed another one in Ryan Glasgow out of Michigan this year. Billings, I think that was everybody's favorite pick of last year, just based on value and his game tape and everything. Unfortunately, he missed the entire year, so that leaves some question marks. Who do you see kind of having the inside track now that Damata Pico's gone? And these guys, there's a big scrum there. Is it a veteran, a Sims, Thompson, that sort of thing, or is it one of these young guys?
I'm going to say, I guess when I'm thinking of the guys starting next to Atkins, I'm thinking of that position they're looking for. And if Atkins is more of your three technique, at least my impression is someone like a Deshaun Williams or Marcus Hardison is probably more in that mold, more the penetrator, the guy that like Geno Atkins, whereas the guy who is more likely to replace Pecco is, your big guys lining up over the center inside the guard, that big beefy body that in theory you want taking hopefully a couple tackles, that immovable object kind of a player, that one that can kind of control the middle. And to me, that seems like that mold is either down to Billings, Thompson, Sims, or Glasgow most likely. And based on the Bengals' love of veterans, it would seem like Sims or Thompson would have the inside track. But I guess I'm going to be the optimistic person who looks at upside and say I really want it to be Billings, because I think we kind of got the impression last year the team really wanted to be Billings. It seemed like he was getting a lot of snaps in training camp, and there was a lot of talk from the Bengals staff, who usually don't talk up defensive rookies too much early in camp. They really seemed to be high on him, and you kind of got the impression they were a little devastated when he went down, because it seemed like they had a lot more expectations for him as far as playing time as the team would compared to what they would normally give a younger guy. So I'm gonna assume, when it's all said and done, especially since he seems to be coming back fully healthy, I think it's going to be Andrew Billings and Atkins as the two starters. But I can't say I've ever I've never been wrong before. But if I were to guess, I would say, just based on how I think the defense wants to use them and the little pieces I'm trying to put together from what has kind of leaked out from Paul Brown Stadium, I'm going to guess it's Billings.
I tend to agree with you. I think they're a little leery. I haven't heard this specifically. I think they're probably a little leery in handing him the job, just because not only is he a young guy, but he missed the entire year last year. But I agree with you in terms of what they saw last year. Obviously, Billings, for those who don't know, was known as an absolute monster in the weight room in terms of bench press and, all kinds of the big workouts that you want to see a defensive lineman excel at. He did it, and he dominated at Baylor. There were times that they thought that he wasn't that great against the pass, but I think as a senior he had something like 5.5 sacks as a defensive tackle. So I don't know if that's a completely founded argument against him. I think, though some pundits had him going to the Bengals in the first round in last year's draft, I didn't think he was a first round talent, but I definitely thought he was better than a fourth round talent. So for me, I think if you're looking for the guy who's maybe first on the field that trots out with the rest of the starters, probably Billings if he stays healthy and looks like the same brute that he did in college and in the early parts of camp last year. But I think this is going to be a by committee thing, and that's why I think guys like Thompson and Sims might hang around. I've always been a big Pat Sims guy. I know he's not the most flashy player, but he has been a great fit for this team for so many years. He had one good season with the Raiders, one kind of down season. Then he's come back on these little rental deals, but stays out of trouble. He knows the system well. He's a great run stopper. I remember him having some good games against the Steelers in the past. So I think if you're looking at a guy who may come out for first down, maybe first two downs, that's the guy. Then maybe bring in a Sims. And it's kind of what they do at running back. Maybe there's different series where Sims is in there, Thompson's in there. Maybe they use the 2-3 technique guys to get to the passer. Maybe they kick in a defensive end on passing downs to get guys like Willis and Lawson off the edge. So I think they're going to get creative, but I think you're going to see Billings in there. I think you're going to see one of those veterans. I don't know that they keep both Sims and Thompson, but they might. I think one of those guys at least makes it and probably rotates in there frequently. And maybe as Billings begins to get his feet back under him, both in terms of recovery from injury and learning the pro game, I think then you'll kind of see him take over more snaps. But they do have a lot of talent there. They have a lot of talent defensive tackle, so it's a good problem to have. Unfortunately, they might just let some pretty good guys go based on the rest of how the rest of their roster is shaking up. And this next question is from Cliff 3JLL, and this is one we've talked about before, but this is the time of year, Scott, where the Bengals give out contract extensions, mostly to players. They usually do a lot of their star guys or pretty good players that they they're maybe in the last year of their deal or something of that nature. They give out an extension just so they don't hit free agency, which is a good thing. And when we get frustrated about what they don't do in free agency, some of that money then goes to these extensions. So this isn't about a player, though, Scott. This is about Marvin Lewis. Does Marvin Lewis play out the 2017 season without a contract, or do you think he gets an extension before week 1? Now, maybe the draft and the players they've amassed there has something to do with it in terms of playing in his corner. Usually, even though the Bengals do contract extensions in the summer for players, usually when Lewis has done these little extensions, these 1-year, 2-year deals, at least as of recently, that's been more in the January, February months. And now here we are almost in June. Pretty interesting, and I don't know what to think. I think personally I'm inclined to think that they're going to let him play out as a lame duck coach, even though they don't want him to, just because of where we are right now. But what do you think?
I would have to say I totally agree with you. I think they, as much as the Bengals' track record seems to indicate, they like to stick with mediocrity and they kind of defend their own and keep their own. There are some signs they've shown over the last year or two that make you think that, okay, maybe this team does finally get it. Maybe they feel that loyalty is good, but ultimately you need the best players and the best coaches and the best everything on the field. Yep. I mean, they finally got rid of Nugent and mid-season, which I think was highly unexpected. You look at some of the other things they did. They finally let Brandon Tate go before the season, something we never thought would happen. They've seemed to be making some moves that seem to be common sense football moves, but moves that, based on their history, you just kind of surprise you to see the Bengals making. So that being said, I think they're finally getting that, yeah, this guy was better than what we had before him, but 15 years later, we're still looking for a playoff win. So I think that I'm assuming they're like thinking, okay, we're just going to let him play it out, see what happens. If we don't get any better, we don't get the playoff win, enough's enough, it's time to move on. Or they give him another one, sign him for one more year. Because I think at this point, it's not like some teams are lining up to take Lewis from us. So I don't think you need to lock him up if you're worried someone's going to grab him. And at that point, and I know Mike Brown's a huge loyalty guy based on how his dad was treated when he left Cleveland and how that all unfolded. And they tend to be loyal to a fault in that regard. But 15 years is pretty loyal for someone that hasn't won you a playoff game yet. So I would be surprised, maybe somewhat disappointed, if he got an extension before the season ended until he kind of shows something.
Yeah,
and by something, I mean,
yeah, and I think the key point of Cliff's question was before week 1, at least for me. It's not like I don't think the Bengals will re-sign Marvin Lewis after this. The thing is like you said, teams aren't necessarily lining up for him. Maybe if he is willing to take a coordinator position somewhere, if he ends up not re-signing with the Bengals, maybe then he'd be a very hot commodity. Maybe if he wants a front office position somewhere and whatever. But I think the week before week 1 is the key part of Cliff's question for me, where I don't think this summer we're going to see an extension for Marvin Lewis. We've seen crazier things happen, so I could be very wrong on this. But I don't think that's happening. But if somehow, week 10 rolls around, week 11, something like that, the Bengals are 7-3, the Bengals are 8-2. They're right in the midst of the playoff picture, maybe vying for another AFC North title. Then I think in season they would maybe get something done. Now, I know the team doesn't like to do that. I know Marvin Lewis doesn't like to do that. They've said that publicly, that they like during the season to focus on football. But maybe it's kind of, hey, let's kind of see what we have on the field first this year. And maybe it's it's not quite a prove it year. But if you show us something significant and that last year was more of a blip on the radar and that you've built a consistent winner once again, maybe then it's an in-season contract extension that could happen. I just don't know if I see it coming before the season. Scott, did you have any additional thoughts on that?
On that note, but there were a couple more questions I was going to answer quickly if we had time.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. A couple that I saw in the YouTube chat. The first one was from Tyler Adlita, who I hope I got your name right. Question about Kevin Minter. Basically, who is he? And I'm just going to kind of sprint through these. Essentially, what we've gathered from Arizona Cardinals fans is he is a better Ray Maluga, is the best way to put it. They let him go because they were looking for speed. He wasn't as fast as the linebackers they have, so they kind of saw him as a weak link as far as speed goes. So that's why they let him go. As far as the Bengals go, he's definitely better than Ray Maluga. So that's why he is now in Cincinnati, and Maluga is not in Cincinnati. The other quick answer I wanted to give is for Shells Heavy, which is a question about Joe Mixon. By what week do you see Joe Mixon being named as Bengals starting running back? Personally, I think it's going to be week 1 of 2018.
Yeah.
Just don't see it happening this year. I think it's going to be Jeremy Hill. He's in a contract year. He's in his last year. I see the Bengals sticking with him at least, that first snap of every game. And when Bernard comes back, I think he is going to possibly be this. I think what's all said and done, Mixon could see the most touches this year of the running backs. I just don't see the team making him the starter. And I think it's somewhat just Marvin's nature. He is a rookie, and there is that thing. I think they want to try to show that, you do have all this baggage and all that stuff. We're not going to reward you because, with a starting role, we're going to make you, well, you're our best player, so we're not going to sit you the whole season, but we're not really going to, make you that starter per se. So that's two quick answers I wanted to give on a couple questions.
I did see those, and I just, time perspective, I omitted them, but I'm glad you got to them. And just real quickly on Mixon, there's two schools of thought, and this plays into the last question about Marvin Lewis's contract extension. If he doesn't get one and he is in that lame duck status, maybe he's more inclined to say, look, if this is the best guy, regardless of the issues, regardless of his own possible personal beliefs of we got to make him earn it, we got to make sure that this guy who has had trouble, we don't give him too much of a chance at stardom too fast. It could go to his head, whatever that looks like. Maybe because he does not have a contract, maybe he says, screw it, and he gets him on the field early. Our own Joe Goodberry, who has been on this program, has done some stuff for Cincy Jungle. I believe he threw out a tweet a few days ago that said he believes Mixon could be the number 3 guy in the Bengals offense in terms of receptions. So maybe that's where they start using him early on instead of more so as a true running back. They do have a guy like that in Gio Bernard, but he is coming off of a knee injury. So, I think they'll get creative in ways to use him. It's just a matter of how. I still think Jeremy Hill is going to be that short yardage, maybe goal line guy. Giovanni Bernard's probably going to do a lot of different things. And then Mixon will be in there. I don't want to say week 1 of next year he'll be the starter, but, I think you'll see him out there as the year wears on. He might go out with the first team. Again, kind of the thing we talked about with the defensive tackles where even though he's the starter by game clock standards, I guess, he may not be, carrying the ball 25, 30 times, getting 40, 45 touches a game. Maybe it's more 15 to 20 touches a game, that sort of thing. But maybe it increases as the year goes on. Thanks for answering those, Scott. We're going to get out of here, and thank you all for your fan questions. We appreciate it. We love answering these. We love that you guys tune in every week live. Keep them coming. If you weren't able to join us live, you can send them on all the mediums I mentioned earlier, especially on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. Scott, we're running low on time, but I know we usually do a final thought segment. So what I thought we'd do, because you've been aching to talk about movies and that sort of thing, give me a movie or two you saw recently that you think our listeners, and by the way, even though we're a Bengals podcast, we still are interested in pop culture. We still, we do other things besides just the Bengals, even though it's a big part of our lives. Scott, give me a movie or two you either watched, whether it's a new movie or an older movie you rewatched that the listeners should watch or watch again since you've recently seen it?
Now, if we're doing movies, I'm going to go ahead and do actual theater movies. And this probably, yeah, I will say I get to about one theater movie a year. So the last movie I saw, basically the only movie I've seen in the last year, but it was very good. It was the recent Star Wars movie, Rogue One, which if anyone for some reason has not seen that, and in any way likes anything Star Wars, even similar to Star Wars, or just likes movies that have action or whatever, you have to see it. It was, if your taste for Star Wars was totally ruined by those episode 1, 2, and 3, you definitely need to get that out of your system. This is a great way to do it. It kind of takes you back to what made the movies good. So if we're going to go with one movie I've seen recently, that is the movie I've seen the most recently, which would have been around Christmas, I guess. And that movie, I would have seen it 10 times if I could. Well, maybe not 10, but I would have seen it, yeah, quite a few times. That is a great movie for anyone who likes anything in any way related to movies. If you like lightsaber movies or spaceship movies or just movies on a screen, that is a good one to go see. And
some of you who are listening may be judging Scott and saying, hey, that was 6 months ago, man. Get out to the theaters. Well, you might be a person that does not have a young child. And I used to go to movies quite frequently. And I have a 3-month-old at home, and that has completely ceased. There was the movie Logan that I wanted to see in the theaters. Didn't get to see that. There was Guardians of the Galaxy that just came out, the Volume 2, which, by the way, the first one was great, and I hear the second one is also. I haven't gotten to see that yet. I will say this. I got one, and let me make a comment real quick on Rogue One. I'm an ardent Star Wars guy. There were things I really, really, really liked about it, Scott. There were a couple of, again, I guess I'm kind of an old soul because there was I don't want to spoil it, but there was a couple of Star Wars staples that you have become accustomed to that were not in Rogue One. So if that bothers you, watch it. Go watch it. It's a great movie, but nonetheless, you might sit there and go, where was that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about. Okay. So movies, I mentioned Logan. I actually I had a relaxing day for once, and I rented Logan. I guess it just came out. That is a very good movie. It's a little slower, much different from all the X-Men movies, but if you are a comic book nerd, if you like comic book movies, superhero movies, this is a great movie. It's not so much real heavy on 14, an Avengers or the other X-Men movies where there's 14 different superheroes. It's more of an emotional movie. It's very different, but very good. I'm sure I'm way behind the curve on that, but one I might be ahead of the curve. It's both old and new. And this is for people that like eerie, weird, make you think, what did I just watch type of stuff. And it's Twin Peaks. For those who are older, I guess, Twin Peaks was a show that came out for 2 seasons in 1990 and 1991. I believe it was on CBS or NBC, and it was very weird. It's about this quirky FBI agent who goes to this small town and is investigating a murder of a young woman, and it's very weird, very different. And for those of you who are movie buffs, it's by David Lynch, who's a complete weirdo. But it's good. It makes you think. It's a little cheesy, at least in 1991. The TV show was a little cheesy, but they rebooted the series, which is a continuation off the ending of that series. It's now on Showtime. It's much more, I don't want to say, I guess, risque. It's much more, it's kind of, this was a show that should have been developed for cable television and not, your normal channels. And the first episode came out. It was a 2-hour episode last Sunday. I happened to watch it, and it was very good, very weird. It's not for everybody. I will say that. If you kind of like, not to think too much or whatever, it's not for everybody, but it is very good if you like some weird stuff. But you need to watch, it's on Netflix. You need to watch the Twin Peaks series. before you watch the new Showtime series. But I recommend it. Check it out. Scott, you have one more before we get out of here.
Yeah, actually, I have a question on that. So have you seen both seasons of the original Twin Peaks?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that is a very weird.
It's odd. It's totally weird. It's totally weird, but it's also like it's one of those things for me. I was like, this is bizarre, but I got to keep watching. Now
that
the new one is based off it. There's a lot of bizarre aspects to it, but it's just based on the fact that it's 25 years later. It's much more well done, and it's along the lines of a True Detective, some of those edgier type of shows. And like I said, I think it's just more made for cable TV than it is for, what's called it. And like I said, if you watch the original series, you're going to get some tacky stuff. You're going to get some stuff that's, it's 25 years old, but it's also very entertaining and very weird. It makes you think.
So I guess the new one still has the same detective eating his cherry pie and all that.
Sort of.
Okay. Well,
He's in it.
Since we're doing a show, I'll mention a show also, one that I've been streaming. I think I mentioned before, I'm a cord cutter, so we don't see a lot of new shows, but I tend to stream a lot of shows from Amazon. And I have found the perfect cure for insomnia, unintentionally. I mentioned Star Wars, a huge sci-fi fan. Going back and I'm going through the Star Trek series. I'm going through TNG, going through Voyager. I'm now currently making my way through DS9, which is Deep Space Nine, for those who don't know the abbreviations. It's a Star Trek series that came out in the late 90s. Anyway, so far I'm like halfway through season 1. I don't think I've made it through a single episode without falling asleep and then having to rewatch it the next day. Unintentionally.
Okay.
But if you are tired and looking for, I just need to get to sleep. And this is a slam on that show, but that is a great way to just, get on Amazon or wherever you can find it, put on DS9, within 30 minutes you will be out.
Good to know. I haven't been a Star Trek guy, to be honest with you. I'm a big Star Wars guy, never been a Star Trek guy. It's never interested me, which is really funny because usually you like one or you like the other, but not for me. But there is a major contingent of Star Trek fans as well, Trekkies. So check that out. I know it's not Bengals related. I know it's a Bengals podcast, but this has been on our mind. It's in the summer months. We gotta give you guys some things to talk about besides Bengals football. Something to talk about by the water cooler.
At the stadium. We have a Bengals stormtrooper at the stadium at the football games. I'm looking for that.
I have pictures with him.
Now you need to find a Borg or a Klingon in a Bengals outfit.
Oh my. Let's get out of here, Scott. It's been great. I'm glad we talked about a number of topics. Appreciate you joining me. Unfortunately, Connor Howe couldn't be joining us tonight. We will be having some guests coming up in the coming weeks, so tune into that. Again, you can join us every week on Cincy Jungle and YouTube live. If you're unable to get to watch the show live, download us on iTunes, download us on SoundCloud, download us on our YouTube channel, all of that stuff. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Bengals OBI. Give us a follow, and we appreciate you guys tuning in. I want to say before we get out of here, and this is actually where I'm going right now. Congratulations to my brother-in-law and sister-in-law who had their baby this morning. I'm going to go to the hospital and visit him right now. And he's going to be a neat little cousin that's just 3 months younger than mine. So they'll be little buddies. So congratulations to Cody and Michelle. Stoked for you guys and looking forward to a lot of cousin time coming up. This has been the Orange and Black Insider. For Scott Schulze, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for downloading. We'll see you on the next episode.